Good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. With webinar sessions attracting a global audience like this one indeed does, I found this the safest greeting. Joining me on the screen today is Dr. Motsamai Molefe, one of 9 Ubuntu Dialogue Exchange Fellows for 2021, and Professor Nontobeko Moyo, Program Director at the School of Social Work at Indiana University in South Bend, USA. Professor Moyo will be in conversation with Dr. Molefe today in response to his work. I will introduce both of them shortly. I want to welcome you to this event on behalf of my counterpart at Michigan State University, Dr. Upenyu Maji, and the principal investigators on the project, Professor Jamie Monson at Michigan State, and Mr. Bongani Mgijima at Stellenbosch University. This webinar is the 5th in this year's exchanges, featuring Ubuntu Dialogue Exchange Fellows from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State Universities. For those of you who are not familiar with the project, a brief description. The Ubuntu Dialogues project is an international exchange program between Michigan State University in the United States and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The lead department at Michigan State is the African Studies Center, and at Stellenbosch University, the project is hosted by the Stellenbosch University Museum. The Seminar Exchange Program is one of 3 components of the project. Apart from the seminar exchanges, the Ubuntu Dialogue project also involves a student graduate fellowship and a series of conversations between students from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. Our hope at the project is that in opening up these spaces for talking and thinking will help us all to do the work of revisiting, rethinking, and indeed reimagining the meaning of Ubuntu within individual and collective spaces. The work of Dr. Molefe and Professor Moyo urge us to do this heavy lifting of revisiting, rethinking, and reimagining. Dr. Molefe shifts the focus from the collective to the individual. For him, the promise of, and I quote him, moral achievement that is inherent in conceptualizing a world where we experience the relational values of Ubuntu starts with a person, Umuntu. In my interpretation, forgive me, Dr. Molefe, if it is a misinterpretation, this does not mean a personal that is not political. The Ubuntu, the person, and her human dignity is central to an ethical vision of institutions. I think you talk about a moral, political, and legal infrastructure that acknowledge and respect the dignity of a person in order for a decent society to emerge. Professor Moyo situates Ubuntu as a value that is part of lived experiences in Africa. But the word Ubuntu has now been globalized, as this project is an example of, and, argues Professor Moyo, its evocation of, and I quote her, a shared humanity, end of quotes, is not enough to carry the weight of a vision of a world in which we live peacefully with one another and the environment. To think of Ubuntu is to recognize the pitfalls of producing a conceptual pathway that gets hijacked by, and I quote Professor Moyo again, the dynamics of geopolitical knowledge production, end of quote, that upholds and reproduces Eurocentric interpretations of Ubuntu. To unpack this, she captures the persistent spaces of subjugation, whiteness, religion, and capital, where the foundations of Ubuntu get erased. And I quote her, even and perhaps especially in our embrace of Ubuntu, end of quote. If you, like me, feel overwhelmed, even paralyzed by binary position taking, by what seems to be a tendency to build walls rather than breaking walls down between people, by the signs of an overwhelmed planet, then today's conversation about Ubuntu, human dignity, and a decent society is relevant and necessary. And I, for one, am looking forward to the contributions from Dr. Molefe, Professor Moyo, and later on also from you, the audience. It is my pleasure to introduce first today's respondent, Professor Nontobeko Moyo, and then our Ubuntu Dialogues Seminar Exchange Fellow, Dr. Motsamai Molefe. Otrude Nontobeko Moyo is a professor and director at the School of Social Work, Indiana University, South Bend. Her scholarship focuses on social development issues in Southern Africa, racism in human services and higher education, everyday violence, decoloniality, and social change as it pertains to Southern Africa, Africans in diaspora, and indigenous communities. In 2019, Dr. Moyo was awarded the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship to work in collaboration with the Social Work Department at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. Her scholarship uses ethnography and collaborative applied research. She has been teaching both at undergraduate and graduate levels for the past 20 years. Dr. Moyo has published several articles addressing social development issues in Southern Africa, interrogating racism in human services, everyday violence, and social change. Her articles have been published in Feminist Economics, Social Development Issues, International Social Work, and Journal of Progressive Human Services. Her book publications include Trampled No More, Voices from Bulawayo's Townships about families, life, survival, and social change in Zimbabwe, and lately Africanity, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Professor Moyo, and Ubuntu as Decolonizing Discourse, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Other scholarly interests include prevention of substance abuse in communities of color, discourses of diversity and social justice, intercultural awareness, environmental justice, and community-engaged teaching and learning. Motsamai Molefe holds a PhD in philosophy. He is currently a senior researcher at the Center for Leadership in Ethics in Africa at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. He has recently been appointed as an acting research manager at Govan Mbeki Research and Development Center at the University of Fort Hare. Dr. Molefe's research largely focuses on African analytic philosophy. His areas of specialization are African and Western ethics, applied ethics, bioethics and environmental ethics, and social and political philosophy. His work is centered on moral political concepts, human dignity, needs, personhood, and Ubuntu. Dr. Molefe's research has earned a National Research Foundation Y2 rating. He serves as an advisory board member of the Global Philosophy of Religion Project. Dr. Molefe has published articles in numerous journals, the Journal of Value Inquiry, Cultura, Monist, Politikon, among others. He has published 3 monographs and 2 are forthcoming. An African Philosophy of Personhood, Morality and Politics, published by Palgrave Macmillan, African Personhood and Applied Ethics, published by NISC, and thirdly, an African Ethics of Personhood and Bioethics, a reflection on abortion and euthanasia, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Partiality and Impartiality in African Philosophy, published by Lexicon Books, and Human Dignity in African Philosophy, a very short introduction published by Springer. He recently co-edited the book Towards an African Political Philosophy of Age, published by Palgrave Macmillan this year. Dr. Molefe, over to you, and then you can join in Professor Moyo, and I will return to the screen to moderate the question and answer session.
Good afternoon for those who are in southern parts of Africa, and good day to everyone else around the world. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I have a few minutes. 20 to 25 minutes to share basic insights. The topic of my discussion, as you have seen, as you would have seen, touches on three important concepts. It's Ubuntu, human dignity, and a decent society. Ubuntu, human dignity, and human society. The discussion aims to make two important interventions in the literature and philosophy, specifically in ethics and politics. These interventions, I think, they are obvious, but they are underexplored in the literature and in many other discussions around Ubuntu. So I just want to suggest this shift because I think it's important. The first shift that I want to suggest falls within the domain of ethics. The second shift that I want to propose falls within the domain of political theory or political thought in the literature on Ubuntu. Roughly, the first shift, these two interventions, they are related, though they may sound like they're contradictory, but they're related. The first shift suggests that we need to move. Our emphasis must not be on Ubuntu. Our emphasis must be on Ubuntu. Our emphasis must not be on Ubuntu. Our emphasis must be, I use the idea of Ubuntu to refer to a person. The emphasis must be on a person. The emphasis must not be on Ubuntu. So the first intervention I make in the literature on Ubuntu is that in our analysis, in our exposition, in our application of Ubuntu, our focus, our primary focus, if I may say, has to be on a person or Ubuntu, and not so much on Ubuntu. This makes sense if you draw a distinction between two ways that this concept of Ubuntu can be used. I draw a distinction between a capitalized form of Ubuntu and an uncapitalized form of it. I'll come back to those details. But the first intervention I'm making is that emphasis must be on Ubuntu, a person, and not on Ubuntu. And the notion of Ubuntu at play here is the non-capitalized form of it. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. The second intervention in the literature is that focus must not be on Ubuntu, non-capitalized form, and focus in a sense must also not be on Ubuntu, but focus must be on social conditions within which Ubuntu exists. So there seems to be a tension here, but you will appreciate that the tension is just in appearance when you realize that the first intervention is within the moral domain, right? In terms of how to think about our relationship and our duties to a person. What must be the primary consideration? And my suggestion is that the primary consideration must be the value that inheres in a human being before she does anything in the world. That's the first consideration. The second consideration must be, before we even think about what the human being owes us, we should be asking our collectively organized life, specifically in the form of the state and the institution that represent it. What does the state owe to individuals? Those are two important shifts I'm suggesting that I want to get into so that we get a point. So to get into those shifts, I'm going to start by drawing a distinction which is important. Before I analyze how I understand Ubuntu as a moral philosophy, I need to draw a distinction between two distinct uses of the word Ubuntu. So we could use the word Ubuntu in a capitalized form, or at least I do so, in a capitalized form, or we could use the word Ubuntu in a non-capitalized form. Ubuntu in a capitalized form refers to the concept, refers to a system of thought associated with the African people, particularly the Bantu people. So when we use the notion of Ubuntu in that sense, we're not talking of a property of an individual. We're talking of, if you like, a system, epistemological, metaphysical, and axiological that is characteristic of the Bantu people. In other words, you are looking into a philosophy of a people when there's that use of Ubuntu, right? And this notion then in a sense is historical. When you look among the African people, specifically the Bantu people, you're going to discover that there's a particular knowledge system that they have, that the particular way they think about reality, there's a particular way they think about morality. And that particular system of thought is what I call Ubuntu in a capitalized form, right? Ubuntu as a philosophy, right? And then within that Ubuntu as a philosophy, then you have Ubuntu ethics, right? So Ubuntu ethics is part of this capital letter U, right? Ubuntu ethics. So that's a capitalized form of Ubuntu. And so it's a historical concept associated with these people, but it's not just historical. It's still existing. That's why we're having this conversation, because we're tapping into that intellectual framework, intellectual resource associated with the Bantu people, right? But also, there's another way we talk about Ubuntu. There's a way when we talk about Ubuntu, we're not talking about the system, but we're talking about a person. When we say, she has Ubuntu, we are making a moral judgment about the quality of the character of an individual, right? So there are those two distinct uses of Ubuntu, right? So you could talk about Ubuntu as a philosophy, and as a philosophy, in my thinking, it's got those three features. It's got the metaphysical component, it's got the epistemological component, and it's got the axiological component. The axiological component covers what I call Ubuntu ethics and politics. So what I'm going to be doing today is an exposition of Ubuntu ethics. And the goal of Ubuntu ethics, so two things, maybe let me clarify it like this. Ubuntu ethics is captured by a maxim that is found among the wisdom of the African people. And this wisdom is captured in the aphorism, Umuntu gumuntu gabantu, or translated in English, a person is a person through other persons. This aphorism, if you are familiar with the sayings and the proverbs of the African people, it's one of those that are important. In this particular work, I'm going to focus on two of these aphorisms. The first one I'm going to do to give us an understanding of Ubuntu ethics is the one, a person is a person through other persons. And I emphasize the word person in Zulu is umuntu, or in Sotho is mutu. So I'll be using those interchangeably to refer to a person, umuntu or mutu in Sotho. So I've just given you a rough distinction between Ubuntu and Ubuntu with a capital letter U and Ubuntu with a small letter U. Right, so yeah, so now let's get to Ubuntu as a moral theory. The first intervention, Ubuntu as a moral theory. Ubuntu as a moral theory is captured by the aphorism or the maxim, a person is a person through other persons. This aphorism, if you look at it very closely, has got three components. The first component is the component of a person. That's the first component. The second component is the component is a person. The third component is through other persons, right? So you've got the first element of Ubuntu, you've got the second element of Ubuntu, and you've got the third element of Ubuntu. All these elements have got one thing in common. In all of them, the notion of a person appears. In the first two forms, it appears in the singular. A person is a person. The last one, it appears in plural, ngabantu, kabatu babangwe, or through other persons, right? For the purposes of my analysis, I'm going to leave out the third element. I'm going to focus on the first two elements. A person is a person. So immediately what should strike you, at the heart of Ubuntu, at the heart of Ubuntu ethics, at the heart of Ubuntu ethics is the concept of a person. At the heart of Ubuntu ethics is the concept of a person, or what I call Umuntu, or Insutumutu. At the heart of it, it's a concept of a person. But now, if you look into the first, into the two components of Ubuntu saying, it sounds like a tautology, because the first element says a person is a person. Well, it's obvious that a person is a person. Could this aphorism be really meaning to inform us of the obvious, of the banal, that a person is a person? My suggestion, and what you find in the literature, is that this should not be understood as a tautology. It should actually be understood as a morally loaded statement. And the statement, to understand the statement, you need to draw a distinction between two distinct uses of the notion of a person. The first reference, a person, refers to a human being, right? So when you're walking in the bush, as you're walking, you see their trees, their birds, and you're just enjoying nature. And as you walk about, you see a moving object. When you look closely, you say, oh, wow, it's a person, right? So that's the first reference to a notion of a person, a reference to a human being, as opposed to a tree or a table, right? It's a metaphysical category that if you look into the furniture in the world, there are such things like you and me that are called human beings. So that's an ontological class of beings. And that ontological class of beings is called persons, right? So that's the first notion of a person, Umuntu. There's a second sense of a notion of a person at work here. So we say a human being is, right? Is. So the second notion of a person is not a descriptive one. That when you walk into a forest and you see a human being, the second one is evaluative or normative, right? It refers to a human being with a good character, a human being with a good character, right? In philosophy, we say it's a normative notion of personhood, or it's a descriptive notion of personhood, right? So you've got these two phrases: a person, a human being, becomes or achieves a good character or achieves Ubuntu through other persons, right? So this statement, these two phrases, they bring into distinction a relationship between what I call an ontological a notion of a person and a normative notion of a person. That a human being, the first notion of a person, is loaded with moral potentiality. And two refers to a human being who is actualizing that potentiality to manifest in their disposition, in their habits, Ubuntu, right? So when we say in the sense, you are a person, we don't mean that you are a human being. That is obvious. We mean you have conducted yourself in ways that are fitting of a human being. In other words, you live to the standards that we associate and expect of a human being. And generally, these are standards of excellence. So very important to note, the first notion is ontological, the second notion is normative. It refers to to a human being who has lived to the standards of excellence. And a person who has lived to the standard of, an individual who has lived to the standard of excellence, we refer to them as a person, or we say they have Ubuntu, but Ubuntu with a small letter U. Put simply, Ubuntu ethics believes that a human being has got the potential to live a moral life. A human being who goes on to achieve that moral potential achieves Ubuntu or becomes a person. Two distinct notions of a person. The one is descriptive, the other one is moral. I just wanted to appreciate that. The first intervention comes precisely there. Emphasis on the discourse of Ubuntu has been on to what a human being must achieve. What we have not really paid attention to is the first notion, Ubuntu. Because, so the question that bothered me is, why do we care that a human being should achieve Ubuntu? Why should we care that a human being should achieve Ubuntu, right? And the answer that struck me was the fact that it seems that there is something morally special and distinctive about Ubuntu, that we should care that they should achieve Ubuntu. And before we care about Ubuntu achieving Ubuntu, our focus must really be on Ubuntu, to appreciate Ubuntu for her own sake before we appreciate her for the potentiality. So that is why my focus is saying, let's look at Ubuntu herself before we look at the thing that he achieves, the thing that he achieved, Ubuntu. So how to make sense of this? How to make sense of this shift? So there are two ways to make sense of this shift in the literature. The two ways to make sense of this shift in the literature. The first way is suggested by two thinkers, it's Mokgobe Ramose and Tangwa. I'm going to draw a little bit here from Ramose and Tangwa. So Tangwa says we should think that human beings are privileged or are more important in nature and in the world, and he gives this reason. I quote, as human beings, we carry the whole weight of moral responsibility and obligations for the world on our shoulders. He says it is not disputable that while human beings have putative moral responsibilities toward inanimate objects like plants and the lower animals, these latter, plants and lower animals, cannot be so considered without absurdity as having any reciprocal moral obligations towards human beings. So the point is making that there's an asymmetry between the directions of moral responsibility. It seems to make sense to us that human beings have got responsibilities toward plants and animals, but it does not seem that these plants and animals have got responsibility toward human beings. And precisely because of that asymmetry, it makes sense to think that human beings occupy a privilege and a special place in the world. This is one way to explain why Ubuntu is important in the discourse of Ubuntu. And in this way of thinking, human beings are both agents and patients, right? But for the most part, animals and plants can only be patients, things that we can care about, but they can't care about us. And that explains why human beings are important. That's one way to think about it. I don't quite pursue this line of reasoning. The second line of reasoning why Ubuntu is important in the discourse of Ubuntu is captured by Ramose. To capture this insight, Ramose appeals to another aphorism, which he also thinks is important in Ubuntu ethics. And the aphorism is in Sotho. It reads as, Feta kgomo o tshware motho. Literally translated, pass a cow and catch a person. Right? And then he interprets this aphorism to mean, this aphorism means that if and when a choice must be made between the preservation of human life and the possession of wealth that may be dispensed with, then it is imperative to choose the preservation of life, right? So, Fita is a cow, Otware motho is a human being. It says, when you are presented with a choice of what to choose between a cow and a human being, right? He says, you've got a moral obligation to prioritize the human over a cow, right? And what is the reason? Why prioritize the human over a cow? But just at that level, you start to get a sense that behind Ramose's interpretation of Ubuntu is just the idea that Ubuntu or a person, just as they are, they're important, right? If you compare them with any object in the world, a human being must be understood to take a superlative position, right? But how do we account for this superlative position we associate with Ubuntu? He then goes on to say in another paper, the practice of the aphorism, requires the moral education based upon the principles of sharing, concern for one another, and the subordination of wealth to the dignity of the human person as mutu. So we must subordinate wealth to the dignity of the human person as mutu. So the insight that comes here is that a human person, the first notion of a person, what makes human being distinctive and morally important in the world is the fact that they possess a property of dignity. And because human beings possess property of dignity, they rank higher than money, they rank higher than animals, and they rank up above everything in the moral, in the world. Right? In other words, the notion of dignity signifies that there's a status that human beings occupy. And this status is very high indeed. And it is because of this status that when there is a trade-off between a cow, which signifies wealth in this instance, we must catch a human being. We must value a human being. We must cherish a human being. We must respect a human being. Why? Because they have dignity. So very important. So what has happened here is to appreciate that, and this point is going to be important. I don't think time is on my side. There are two ways to think about value in the discourse of Ubuntu. The first way of thinking about value attends to a human person, just as a human person. And the category we use to capture this value is the category of dignity. The second way to think about the human value is in terms of Ubuntu, what a human being achieves. This is a value that assesses the performance, the conduct of a human being. But note what is important. The value of a human being of dignity is prior to the value of a human being in relation to what he achieves. And this is a very important point to note. We achieve personhood. We don't achieve the status of being a person in the first sense. So if you think about it, then the first form of value we possess as human beings is more important than the second form of value that we achieve. Why? Because the second one depends on the first one. And I need to say a little bit about that, if time permits. But I just hope you get this distinction. The first form, so I want you to get this. So the notion of dignity is usually associated with intrinsic value. By intrinsic value, we mean the value of a human person is located in her or him, just as she is. Very important point. The value of Ubuntu is not located on how we perceive them. If we don't recognize this value, there's something wrong with our perceptual schemes. A human being, even without our perception, by just being human, they've got value. And it is this value we call dignity. And this value does not come from institutions. Institutions have to recognize this value. This value comes merely because you are Ubuntu. It's a very profound point. First point I wanted to emphasize. That is why the emphasis on Ubuntu, right? Emphasis on Ubuntu, right? And the second value associated with Ubuntu, I call that extrinsic value. It is a value that emerges relative to how a human being conducts herself and develops her character. Two different kinds of values, right? And I'm saying very importantly, emphasis must be on Ubuntu. We're not discarding what a person achieves, but we're saying for us to properly appreciate what a person achieves, we must properly appreciate a human being before she achieves anything. In other words, I don't have to do anything for you to respect me. You must respect me just for presenting as Ubuntu. Many of the political problems we face in the world is because of this misrecognition of a Ubuntu as Ubuntu. So that's just the first point I wanted to make, right? So if you think of the problem of homosexuality, if you think of homophobia, problem of xenophobia, if you think of form of racism, if you think of a problem, all of these problems, they've got one thing at heart: misrecognition of Ubuntu, right? If I'm homophobic, that doesn't change my status as Ubuntu. So this shift This shift says that respect Ubuntu because he is Ubuntu. And because he is Ubuntu, he deserves respect. Let me just mention 3 things before I move to, time is an enemy. Let me mention 3 things about dignity before I go to the last point. The notion of dignity, as I've suggested to you, talks about the moral preciousness of a person, or the idea of moral worth of a person. This idea of dignity is associated with 3 important concepts in moral philosophy. The first concept is the concept of constraints. The second concept is the concept of empowerment. The third concept is the concept of equality or social egalitarianism. Roughly. So the notion of constraints, I don't have time to get the details here. It represents the inviolability of a human person. In other words, it says there are certain ways we must never treat a person. In other words, when a person presents themselves, there's an inviolability that surrounds them just because they're persons, irrespective of whether they believe, whatever religion they belong to, whatever sexual orientation they have, just presenting as of Ubuntu. They are inviolable. In other words, there are certain ways we must never treat them. Those ways, they are wrong. Those ways are not just wrong, they wrong you as Ubuntu. Right? So you draw a distinction between wrong actions and actions that wrongs a person. They violate you, they harm you, right? So that's the first notion associated with dignity, that human beings are inviolable and must be respected as such. Second point is the idea of empowerment. Ubuntu deserves conditions that allows them to live a human life, conditions that empower their abilities. That's the second notion related to dignity. And the last notion related to dignity is the notion of social egalitarianism. All of us, just because we are Ubuntu, we are equal, and therefore we deserve equal treatment, irrespective of choices we make in the world. When I present as Ubuntu, I deserve equal treatment. So that's why focus of Ubuntu on Ubuntu or a person is so fundamental, because it connects to the idea of dignity and then says we need to respect Ubuntu just because he is Ubuntu. Whether you achieve Ubuntu or not is in an important sense irrelevant, because before you even do anything, you already matter for your own sake. First point, I'm done with the first intervention. I think I'm left with 5 minutes or so. I'm going to run quickly to the second intervention. The second intervention is of a political nature. On this intervention, so we've discovered that Ubuntu is important, right? But now we're asking ourselves an important question about the importance of Ubuntu. If Ubuntu is so important, what kind of conditions must Ubuntu exist in? Particularly, if we still expect Ubuntu to achieve Ubuntu. One of the things that I found extremely offensive about how Ubuntu is discussed in the literature largely is we expect Ubuntu to achieve Ubuntu while Ubuntu exists in conditions that are anti-Ubuntu. A person is living in squalor, is living in shacks, no proper infrastructure, they're raised by a single mother with no proper support, victim of gender-based violence, and we still expect those children to thrive and to have Ubuntu. While we're not asking ourselves that fundamental question about what condition must hold for Ubuntu to be able to live as Ubuntu. That's the second intervention. And this intervention looks at the state. What condition must a state create? So a very, very basic point I want to make here often is that often instead of thinking that people have failed to achieve Ubuntu, society has failed to create conditions of Ubuntu. So this really shifts. And I've said this also about students who fail matric. I say often it's not that we are assessing the wrong institution. We are assessing students. Well, we should be assessing institutions. Have they created conditions for matriculants to be able to study effectively and to engage the literature, the knowledge, the learning context? So you find that we have misplaced the failure by locating it on the student while it is institutions that have failed. So in other words, if you look, and this, if we look into the post-apartheid South Africa and we are committed to the project of Ubuntu, the most important question that we are supposed to be asking ourselves, what mandate is supposed to characterize a post-apartheid state? And how to make sense of this mandate, right? And in my intervention, I suggest that we use we use a framework of what I call a decent society. And I draw this framework from a Jewish philosopher called Avishai Margalit. Avishai Margalit in 1996 writes a book called A Decent Society. And the submission of this book is this, which I find very attractive. I wish I had time to justify it, is that a decent society is one whose social institutions do not humiliate its people or citizens. Social institutions, it's a macro-ethical concept. It's not a micro-ethical concept. It's looking at the whole setup of society. And when we look into a society that is decent according to Ubuntu, that wants to create decent conditions for Ubuntu, say this society must not humiliate its citizens, right? So by social institutions here, two ways to think of social institutions. You think of social institutions in terms of laws and principles and policies, and you think of social institutions in terms of the conduct of these social institutions, how they conduct themselves. So apartheid is an institution in both senses, right? It has particular laws, and it has got particular kind of conduct, right? Particular kind of conduct. And when you say it was a terrible state, it was an indecent state. We mean it was indecent by the laws of racism it had, and it was indecent also in terms of how it meted out this racism. So it as an institution in two senses, right? So the humiliation, what do you mean by humiliation here? Humiliation is an injury to the self-respect of a person, what I've called dignity, right? What I've called dignity. We think about the whole setup of society, right? And if you think about the whole setup of society, then we start asking very structural questions. What is the condition of education as a whole? And are the condition of education one that are humiliating or one that are non-humiliating? Right? So if you look into the public health facility as an institution, right? There's a social institution of the state to deliver health, right? You ask yourself, are the conditions there such that they're humiliating or non-humiliating, right? Why use the negative rather than the positive, honor rather than positive? And the basic insight is this, is the asymmetry. It is easier to identify the evil than the good. It is easier to identify the evil than the good. But more importantly, the history of South Africa and Africa, of coloniality in South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, has riddled us with a lot of humiliating institutions where people, instead of getting service that respect them, they meet humiliating circumstances. So in framing the future associated with Ubuntu, it makes sense to interpret it in a negative sense, to say we want to create a non-humiliating society where we systematically remove in our social organization, in our collective life, humiliating practices and tendencies. So roughly that's that. Maybe two last points, then I'm done. Point number one, it's an example. During COVID, citizens were given 350 rands in South Africa, right? Whether that is a non-humiliating figure to survive is another question, right? So this is a social institution in our country. It decides to help people during COVID, gives them 350, right? So we can ask a question about that figure. Is this a humiliating kind of handout, or is this a non-humiliating one, right? So you'll use different ways to think about it. You could use the absolute measure of poverty standard to say that a day you need $1 or $2, and then you measure. Right? If that money is less than that measure of absolute poverty, then that figure itself could be an instance of exposing people to humiliation, right? But what got my attention is while we were fighting COVID and helping people, the queues were so long, and the queues themselves, the system was not well organized. The system itself was organized so that you can be seen that you are there to receive the 350 rands. So in other words, your unemployment was announced publicly. right? Announced publicly, for everyone can see that for me was a social institution that was, though in its intention and good intention, it was humiliating, right? So it's a failure in the politics of Ubuntu, in my view. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what I have in mind in an intuitive sense. Finally, I'm done, the last point. One thing to note about this way of thinking about Ubuntu politics, it offers a perfectionist approach to think about a state. Often in the literature, we assume the liberal state that is neutral with regards to the good, what a society should aim for. An Ubuntu-inspired state is a state that has a particular mandate. To use the language of John Rawls, is a state that takes a particular comprehensive doctrine as its basis. And the basis of the state imagined by Ubuntu is a state that creates conditions for individuals to be able to achieve Ubuntu, right? But in my interpretation, and this mandate can be interpreted more usefully by taking the idea of a decent society. The first role of the state is to remove the scourge of humiliation from society at its functionaries, that is social institutions. I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Molefe. I will present another dimension of Ubuntu and touch on what you have helped us see as a way of embracing the diversity of ways of thinking about Ubuntu. Again, why are we thinking or dialoguing about Ubuntu is to improve our quality of life. So I provide another dimension, most notable, a relational approach. The process that I'm going to take, please note how I am introducing this idea of practicing isintu. Ngiyabonga ikakhulukazi to those who have walked before me and ahead of me. Many who have survived multitudes of oppressions, their fight has bestowed a privilege to me to be able to share with you today. In terms of my own positionality, I am a student of society straddling the African continent and the North American continent. But I am particularly thankful for the relationships that have nurtured me to continue to be thinking about what am I doing about Ubuntu in my life as this person. So I'm thankful to particular people. I'm thankful to particular institutions. For example, colleagues at University of Fort Hare in the social work department, Tandukolo, Nomgoia, Pamela, Mlangom, but communities like Bofolo and Nengwebe, who have reminded me that the answers to the issues, the problems that Dr. Molefe shares lie in us as Umtu, lie in us as Abantu, lie in us walking isintu, the practice of Ubuntu. In this regard, as Abantu, the dialogues about Ubuntu, we are seeking, like why engage in this? We are seeking to reconcile ourselves with ourselves, to walk in our own survivance, to give ourselves the right to define how we would like to live, the conditions that we would like to live, the institutions that we would like to live. As a social worker myself, the idea of human agency is very powerful to me. My purpose as a social worker is that I am in my world to improve quality of life. Therefore, the idea that Molefe highlights as us as moral agents, acting on our shared values and principles is powerful to me. This acting is intrapersonal. We have to be looking at ourselves. How am I living as Umtu? How am I living as Umtu in Uluntu, which is the humanity? How am I living as Umtu? It has to be coming from me I exude Ubuntu, like in terms of the moral judgment here, in my interpersonal relations, or I don't achieve that in my interpersonal relations. So how could I achieve that in institutions or in an environment or in the cultural messages? So the idea of these relations say to me at interpersonal level, how am I undoing these oppressions? At my interpersonal levels with others, how am I undoing those oppressions? At structural levels, how am I undoing those oppressions? Therefore, coming to the idea of us as moral agents and moral patients, I'm not a philosopher by training, so I have a hard time with the idea of being a moral agent and a moral patient. In my view, it's a challenging perspective to be a moral agent and a moral patient. For me, it hinges on some of the troubling things that we have. I don't feel that as societies, we have really embraced human nature or human beings as partial conscious beings. But instead, if we use this moral agent, it presents a problematic space where we are valuing people, animals in the world differentially. Instead of just embracing all beings on the planet are beings. And we have a partial understanding of all those beings. Who knew that the trees could talk to each other? But they do. But it's because our own not understanding and or refusing to understand that we are not embracing that animals can, animals can speak to each other, but trees can speak to each other, but trees speak to us as well. So by opening up to this consciousness of our universe, we are opening up to different and diverse ways of knowing ourselves. So my piece is that the focus of Ubuntu is really important. But which person becomes morally responsible? Which person becomes not morally responsible? So the idea of making that dialectic, that there are people who are morally responsible and we are responsible for, we are also erasing the capacity to see the world as offering a more richer perspective of our life. So we can't say Ubuntu Betu can stand alone. Ubuntu stands with the communities that are nurturing them or not nurturing them. They are a reflection of all that. Perhaps the most fundamental piece about the idea of moral patience and moral agents is this notion for me, how I read it, is that it creates a system of elevating some and not others. And historically, we have seen this. So if I am a moral patient, if I'm a moral agent, therefore others can be hierarchicalized as not valuable and acted upon. And historically, we have seen the damage of that. And that's my own perception of what that may mean. An example, one mama in the village where I was in Eslalini in Bofolo shared a story that was deconstructing how this idea of hierarchicalization of human value is, or we as humans get to be more important than anything else. So she said, oh, I had, there was an accident in our village and it was a hit and run and the driver did not stop, but the driver was known of that village and he had passengers. The passengers were people who were in the community. They never all reported the incident. It went on and then until it got to law enforcement. And then when this person was asked, why didn't you stop when you hit the person? The person is now dead. And the driver said, I thought it was a donkey. And the mama said, can you imagine this person saying, I thought it was a donkey? But she went on further to say, did that donkey not have a life? Or did that donkey not belong? So to ask ourselves, Umuntu needs that community that sets the boundaries of what is acceptable. And it is through our relations that we are looking at these relations. But those relations also have to be, what does Ubuntu mean to me intrinsically, to myself? How do I walk Ubuntu in terms of Isintu? So we know that we have been nurtured in communities and societies and nations that advance oppression. To find ourselves, we have to be really thinking about what are the conditions that make us thrive, as Dr. Molefe shares. It means also unlearning oppressions ourselves as people so that we can be guiding interpersonal relations that build that build Ubuntu. We can be guiding conditions in our institutions that are all undoing institutions that are humiliating people. My take on Ubuntu is thus along the lines of the idea that came from the community that says, we recognize we have walked in systems that are oppressive. Therefore, we must demand masihlalisane. So demanding masihlalisane means contending with the other, learning to love the other, not doing unto the other what I would like in my eyes, but doing unto the other what they would like. Going over to the other person to say, what would you like for the institutions to be? What would you like for our relations to be? Therefore, masihlalisane. That masihlalisane recognizes that each one of us, because of that partial consciousness, we are likely to be oppressive. Therefore, we must live Isintu in the sense of mutual respect, ukuzwelana, ubumamelwano. So in terms of, just like to summarize my piece, is that Ubuntu as a social construct is multidimensional. And as scholars, therefore, we must be attentive to what are those narratives that are emerging about Ubuntu. Are they maintaining oppressions or are they undoing oppressions? Some of us have talked, some of us as scholars have said it is meaningless, but we know that its contamination does not mean it is meaningless. It means that we have to sift and throw away that which is contaminant. I will end there and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Moyo and Dr. Molefe, for this wonderful contribution, thought-provoking, as I can see in the questions. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Geraldine Friesler, to handle the answering questions, the question session. Geraldine, where are we starting?
Hi, thank you, Mariki. We will start in the Q&A section, and then there are a few questions in the chat function as well. First, should I go you'll take 5 questions and we'll see how far we get. It's more of a comment. I think it would be useful to have a definition of human dignity. And then I thought the Sesotho definition of human dignity is a definition of human dignity in its own right. And human is spelled Humyxn. And then a little bit of a longer question. Christian ethics believes that a man is a tripartite sorry, someone posted another question, so it moved my cursor. So I'll just start over. Christian ethics believes that a man is a tripartite being, soul, body, and spirit. However, Western civilization, quite extremely different from Western, has now concentrated on seeing human being only as a mono being, where they are concerned only with the body, by mutilating it through LBGTQ without appreciating the other aspect of the tripartite consideration with its consequential effect. Can you explain the structural components of Ubuntu? And is the value of an evil person worth more than a cow to society, more because he or she is a person? And then one more, does aphorism and maxim convey the same message in interpretation?
Thank you, Geraldine. I think that's the first bunch of questions. I can see 18 questions just on my screen. Dr. Molefe and Professor Moyo, I wonder if you could perhaps, we only have about 20 or so minutes left. If you could perhaps decide between the two of you who will take which questions, and of course you are welcome to make additions to the other person's response, but so that we can get as many of the questions responded to in the session, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I could take definition of human dignity. Value of an evil person is more than that of a cow. I just didn't get the other questions they were read. Let me take these two. If there are others, I can come to them. So I used the idea of human dignity conceptually. Conceptually means or denotes human preciousness. The idea that there's something distinctively valuable about being human. Right? So that's what the idea of dignity, the idea of human dignity signifies. That there's something morally special about being a person. Right? So if I'm presented with two objects, this cup of water and a human being, one is not, this has got instrumental value insofar as I can buy it in the market for 5 rands. The value is instrumental because it's determined by the market. But a human being, independent of markets, independent of any social system, just by being human, has got that moral preciousness that deserves respect. So roughly, that's the idea of human dignity. That's the idea of human dignity. And this idea is very important because the idea, so when you take, for example, the idea of xenophobia, where you hate someone just because they're a foreigner, right? Or that kind of hatred is problematic because it's failing to appreciate something morally valuable about a person, irrespective of the contingent fact of where they come from. So the idea of human dignity directs us to see the value of a person, or take the idea of homophobia. It says it's problematic because it says instead of fearing the human being, instead of hating a human being for their sexual orientation, see them for being a person of value. So that's what is beautiful about the idea of human dignity. So when in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, given what we saw in Germany emerges in part because of that, it's because the way Jews were treated undermines something fundamental about about a human being, intuitive that a human being has got that value. So we use the idea of dignity to signify that. Value of an evil person more than that of a cow. So look, two things here, a very complicated question, two things here. A human being, if it is true that she has dignity, she has intrinsic value, no matter what her conduct is. A drug abuser has got dignity. A rapist has got dignity. A raped person has got an inalienable value that we must respect. That's why even when you are arrested as a criminal, we owe you due process to prove your criminality. We can't treat you anyhow. right? It's because you've got that dignity. Now, the question of a cow is a different one. In light of my discussion, one, the notion of a cow is used here symbolically to refer to wealth, right? Because cow among the Nguni people and other traditions was used to represent wealth for social transactions, right? So it could just be understood that way. But quite literally, often in African thought, a human being, no matter what their condition is, always has more value than a cow. In fact, that comparison does not even begin to emerge in African thought. If it emerges, it must be interpreted correctly. I will respond to the question about Pofolo by Dr. Chris Molokan. But all things being equal, a human being. That is why one of the most offensive things among African cultures was human beings being compared to animals. Right? That animalization of human beings was extremely offensive because in African thought, a human being in the hierarchical ontological hierarchy of ontology, a human being occupies a higher position than animals and lower forms of life. Though they've got value, but it's lower than that of animals. So that is why it was very offensive. Right? And one of the offensive things even now is the protection of animals while human beings don't have proper conditions suitable for Ubuntu. That's extremely offensive to a lot of Black people because of the ontology they hold about. In this ontology, human beings occupy a higher frame. So yeah.
Yes, and I get that, but at the same time, thinking about really expanding our consciousness about us and the universe. The idea of we are all beings on this planet. We are partially understanding what other beings are. So in that respect, the mama who asked, does the donkey not have a life when you hit it and go, is a crucial question about the evolution of Ubuntu in terms of how we want our society to be in relation to ourselves as beings, but also in the beings like animals, so the beings that are non-beings.
I agree 100% with you. So if I would give a sophisticated view on this issue, I take Ubuntu to be characterized by what is called weak anthropocentrism. Strong anthropocentrism says all things in the world have got no value, only human beings. Weak anthropocentrism says human beings have got higher value and other things have got lower forms of value. So my view of weak anthropocentrism can accommodate that view. What that person who has killed a donkey has done has failed to show Ubuntu towards animals because animals are sentient, they can suffer. So what he has done is to display cruelty, which is antithetical to Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm. And in another version, like if we are looking at racism, we are looking at all these isms, those people who have said, I am a superior being to the other person, how can they then bring themselves to Uluntu, which is humanity, when they have separated themselves from Abantu? How can they bring themselves to Uluntu after separating themselves? So those are really critical questions for the persons and the institutions that we live, that we have to uncover and undo and unlearn to liberate ourselves, or to create what Molefe is saying about the conditions that are building us towards Ubuntu. I see one piece here that makes me laugh is about the interpretation of Mastlalisane as Maspilisane. I am Ndebele, and when you say Maspilisane, it means the Xhosa cohabit. So it's a funny way, but it is really like the gist of it is, let's live well together. Let's learn to live well together. The conditions of the centuries before have said some people have to live better than others, but we share this one planet. How are we going to live well together?
Thank you very much. These are really complicated questions, and I know there are a few more, so I'm going to ask Geraldine to propose the next set of questions to you.
Thank you, Mariki. There's another question. I'm concerned that this reading of Ubuntu and its privileging of dignity in Ubuntu reproduces the same hierarchies that trouble Western Enlightenment conception of the human. The former values dignity as pervasive in humans only and not animals and plants, while the latter values rationalism as it inheres white male humans and not animals or plants or people of color. What does this conception of Ubuntu offer a different way on thinking about humanism? And to her, it continues to be problematic, notwithstanding its interventions of valuing a human without a priori condition. How does the concept of perspective taking fit into your thinking about human dignity? That it seems to me that some persons learn or develop a capacity to walk in other shoes and some do not. Question from Chris, Dr. Molefe, how do you explain, okay, that was just addressed, I think, the Sotho notion of, in relation to affirming human dignity and evaluation of possession of Poto. Then there is, I think we can possibly fit two more questions in this. In Burundi, Ubuntu can get lost. For example, see Ubuntu. I'm not going to go into trying to say that name. He, she is not a person. He, she is an animal based on one's behavior. What's your take on this? Can dignity be lost if it's intrinsic to Ubuntu? This may be an issue of language. Surely genocide diaries in Burundi and Rwanda who killed over the years using machetes and sticks had lost something in their Ubuntu package. What is it? I would appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe let me jump first. Let me deal with, there's a question here by Dr. Chris, which I think I just touched on, but I didn't give it proper attention. I'm just scrolling down. So it's how do you explain this Sotho notion of bopofolo in relation to affirming human dignity and evaluation of Ubuntu? So the idea of bopofolo in Zulu is ubulwane. When a human being in African cultures behaves in ways that are unseemly and that are below what is expected of a human being, there's a way in which they are related to animals. Then they are animalized. Say, they can even call you a dog, that you are a dog, uyinja. So one thing to note about that, when you refer to human beings and say they are a dog, like sometimes it is said in South Africa, men are dogs. It is not to deny the obvious fact that you are a human person. So that reference is not ontological. That reference is normative, right? So that's the first thing to appreciate. We're not making a claim about your status as a human being. We're making a claim about the quality of your conduct and character. Right? So if your character is not what we expect of a human being, we're saying you are living below what it means to be human. So when we say, or we associate you with bopofolo or obulwane, it is a form of criticism to say, wake up to the possibilities of your humanity. It is not to deny the fact that you've got dignity. So I think that's a distinction we need to make, right? So when we say you have Ubuntu, we mean you are living true of what is expected of a human being. You are generous, you are kind, you are loving. If you go around stealing, raping, being xenophobic and doing all sorts of funny things, we say, hey, he's such a dog, right? When we say that, we mean you are not living in a way that builds community. You're not living in a way that values other human beings and respect them. You are living below what is expected of a human being. So it's a moral judgment of a character of Ubuntu. It's not erasure from the category of Ubuntu. So I think that it's very important. There's a question that is raised about using Ubuntu, which might have problems associated with enlightenment. Look, that problem is going to arise in the technical aspects of this discussion. So in Western philosophy, how they think of dignity in terms of rationality. So in Christianity, they think of dignity in terms of the image of God. So what I did not do in this particular discussion is to give content of what makes us special, what gives us dignity as human beings, right? So maybe for now, I'm going to run away from this question and say, maybe the devil is in the details. One can really accuse my theory that it has got Western limitations when I've presented it in full. For now, I've said, appreciating Ubuntu as a bearer of dignity has got important implications that I think all of us should appreciate. Every human being wants to be respected just because they're human. And the idea of Ubuntu in the discourse of Ubuntu captures that very well. Maybe another point that I might want to touch is, for me, it's interesting. People, when they discuss Ubuntu, they always emphasize relationships, right? And I think they're important. But one thing that they run away from, which is obvious, a person is a person through other persons. There is an individualistic aspect on Ubuntu that is inescapable. Twice, the individual as a single entity is mentioned, then later on is connected to relationships. Right? So it means that a proper understanding of Ubuntu must draw a balance between the importance of an individual and the importance of social relationships. It cannot be that social relationships are more important than the individual, and it cannot be that the individual is more important than the relationship. So one of the interventions I'm making is that a young girl must be appreciated as a young girl. Right? And then when she's put into relationships, those relationships must nurture her to be the kind of woman that she wants to be and the kind of woman that she deserves to be. And she must be able to pursue her own ideals. And then that still leaves us with the tensions of how to live in a community which has got its own demands and how to live your life with your own expectations. But the individualistic aspect is unavoidable.
Yeah, I would say the individuality, uqobo lomntu, not the individualistic nature, or which is connected to social institutions, like individualistic as self-interestedness. But uqobo lomntu, my individuality, is derived from myself and then extends to ngabantu.
I agree with that. The point I'm trying to say is that sometimes a person gets enmeshed in relationships, right? So you struggle then with two important problems. How do you deal with the issue of moral responsibility if relationships are all that does the job? And most importantly, how do you then deal with the issue of moral accountability? Because ultimately it is individuals that must be held accountable. So, and this is very important also to notice, it is not the community or relationship that achieve Ubuntu. It is the individual herself. So when we say you have Ubuntu, we mean you, the individual, right? We don't mean you did it all by yourself, but we mean it was your intentions, it was your efforts, it was your sacrifices that made you to have Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is an achievement of an individual in a social context. Why I'm emphasizing social context? Because many people fail as individuals because of oppressive, unproductive, and negative social context. But ultimately, Ubuntu is the one that achieves Ubuntu.
But because of the social context that we live, it is imperative that we see the inextricable link of the individual with the context that are shaping or sculpting or sharing their lives around. So I cannot
agree.
Yeah, I cannot be an individual that is living Ubuntu when I am in an environment that is exploiting me, that continues to undermine my own dignity as a human being. How can I be an individual living Ubuntu? Sometimes we are. That's why I began my conversation with thanking those who have moved beyond and in front of me and ahead of me, that they have moved in that manner, struggling with these oppressions.
Dr. Molefe, Professor Moyo, we have about 6 or so minutes left. If the audience wanted to, we could. I don't want to extend it for much longer than our agreed schedule, but I can see that there are a lot of questions. So unless, is there another question from the that I have missed or from the ones that Geraldine has posed to you that you haven't addressed yet, or can we go on to the next set of questions?
Yes, there are quite a number of questions, so I'm going to start from the bottom up now.
Maybe we should do two at a time, because when there are five,
yes,
really,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, two very easy ones. Were we not complicit to oppression through Ubuntu? And is there a relationship between Ubuntu and social contract?
Okay, let me jump first in keeping with the president. Well, look, the first question about complicity, I mean, so when I thought of this project, it was precisely to deal with this complicity, right? Of how our social institutions can be really against Ubuntu, and we promote those kinds. So, for example, when the ANC government introduced CLEA as a microeconomic strategy, so this was meant to accelerate economic growth, right? And for some time, you know, our economy was growing. But now President Thabo Mbeki finds himself in a crisis, that you've got a growing economy, but money, this wealth is all still going to the wealthy. So there is no redistribution. And then in his speech, he appeals to Ubuntu, that people must have Ubuntu to assist others, right? So when you look at it at the political performance, no, this is so nice. He's appealing to Ubuntu, but at that level, you see that they had created an economic system that privileges the privileged without putting in place ways of ensuring and enforcing, you know, legally redistribution, right? But if you listen to him deliver a speech, you say, oh, this person is so loving. He's talking about Ubuntu, let's have Ubuntu. While we have not created conditions where the wealthy in the world will see the responsibility to share with others, right? And put in place policies and the kind of tax system that really, you know, is progressive, is meaningful, but at the same time allows and facilitates redistribution. So in that way, you find Ubuntu invoked, but in ways that are not progressive, right? So another example is when people talk about Ubuntu, no, let's forgive each other, let's love each other. But after that, some people are continuing with their privileged life, with their private schools, while some of us go to our shacks, we're left only with forgiveness. No one is thinking fundamentally. If we are going to say Ubuntu as reconciliation, why is this reconciliation not changing all our human condition to be such that we can be able to live a life truly of Ubuntu? So in this way, this use of Ubuntu is very problematic. So that's the motivation that really motivated me taking this approach. What was the other question as well? There was a complicity question, and what was the other one? There was a complicity question, and
let me just check for you.
I am looking at that idea of a relationship between Ubuntu and social contract.
Yes.
So
yes,
that
okay,
the idea of we are always in relationships and we are always making contracts with one another in our living together. Therefore, that idea of Ubuntu as evolving in the contracts that we make in our experiences is crucial. There is a link in the contracts that we make as a society. As he says, we say we have a constitution, we have all these policies. Those are normative things or instrumental things that we say we have, but what if we are not working that? So we are breaking our contracts with what we are saying we do have. So in relation to Ubuntu, Ubuntu helps us to, in my view, Ubuntu is that facilitative politics of are we really living our contracts as a society? Am I really living what I'm saying I am living when I'm saying Ubuntu? Or when I'm invoking Ubuntu, am I living that? So the idea of that, the contractual relationships that we are making not only in relationship, but in the institutions that we are.
I think we have time for one more short round of questions, Geraldine.
Thanks, Mariki. Africa has a novel intuition, and the idea of personhood is inherently relational and explicated and defended by theory. And while the notion that a person is a person through other persons is noteworthy, how do we explain xenophobia? And dovetailing to that question is, as Dr. Molefe made a distinction between a human being and a cup, what came to my mind is that through the experience of slavery and colonialism, we learn that a Black person carries less value than a cup. Basically, the cup is more worthy than a person. If this be the case, when did we become human as Black people? And last question is, I'm concerned about Dr. Moyo's question, which person does not become a moral person, in relation to what, Professor Moyo's question, in relation to what Dr. Molefe has been saying about human dignity and humiliation. If Ubuntu, the first sense of personhood, is to be universalized, how do we approach the problem of evil? The lack of achieving or the refusal of abiding by the second form of Ubuntu? Is it on the state? And if it is on the state, would the carceral logic of modern prison industrial complexes be a logically sound response to that problem within the context of Ubuntu? Or are there any alternatives? Thanks. I think that's quite meaty, so I will leave it.
Very meaty. I'll leave it to.
Can I check the one on my question about which person does not have? I think they asked like my intention about raising that was, if we are looking at the individual, if we are only looking at the individual as a moral agent and as a patient, some of the moral agents have historically, we have used that idea of moral agents and moral patients to hierarchicalize people so that we can say, oh, this is the one to have the agency on this one. So that is the question about which individual is having the moral agency, which does not, which is going to be a moral patient in this situation. So that's the question that I'm asking there.
So Professor Moyo's question, which person does not become a moral person, in relation to your own question about what you were saying about human dignity and humiliation, and that too in relation to the prison complexes, the modern prison industrial complexes.
Yes, thanks a lot. Yes, so that's what my intervention at this level is, to saying that much of the failure, and this has got implications for how to think about colonization. So one of the three things that happened in colonial Africa, and generally, so three things were introduced. So along with dispossession of land, the discovery of minerals in South Africa, I'm going to limit myself there, and the structure of the economy and all of that. So three things were also introduced: a police station, a church, and a court. And then you create unbecoming conditions for other people to live in. And then you've got then the state to enforce the law if they, right? And it's very interesting that I was discussing with other people that there was no such a thing as a prison in African context. The worst form of punishment you'd get is either being killed or capital punishment or being banished from community. Because it's a society that really believes in rehabilitating persons, right? But the point that I think my contribution is making is this: before we emphasize prison, before we emphasize how the state can arrest people, before we have big armies that can really protect nations, have we created conditions that can justify us taking people to prison? Or are we taking people who are failed by institution at the micro level to the macro level, to prison, to run away from the failure of creating a world that allows them to have an opportunity to develop their humanity and live their lives? And often than not, my intuition is that many of the people have been failed by the social conditions that we've created that are not permitting them to live a proper human life. So that's why I'm talking about humiliating conditions of existence that are a feature that is pervasive throughout the world, even Western Africa. So my intervention is to say we need to respect human beings as they are, but one way of respecting them is to have a state that has got a mandate that is very clear. And the first form of thinking about this mandate is let's systematically remove these conditions that humiliate human beings in their existence. And by that, I mean, one example is structural unemployment. If you're unemployment for reasons that have to do with structure, you are now forced to live a life of humiliation. And you can't change that as an individual. You can change your seat, and a lot of young people with qualifications, they can't get a job market because of a weak economy, because of, terrible policies. So those people are subjected to humiliation. And the question that we must be asking is not how people must be skilled further, is how do you change these social conditions so that you systematically change the structures that do not permit Ubuntu to live a life of
and the state as well, the nation state is another one that is already creating these conditions of hardships for people. It's not the prison, the church, and the state as well. How is it doing that in our lives? Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think we have to close this conversation. There was a question from Eleanor David, and she asked the question, Professor Moyo, if it needs to start with me, where do I start? I don't want to respond on your behalf, but I'm wondering if that is a question that, if I'm talking about myself, that question came up with me as well. But is that fair to ask that question of you? I think these kind of conversations lead us into places where we can start, and we must answer that question for ourselves. Only we can answer that question. So I thank you. I want to thank you so much for engaging each other and for the audience. This was a dynamic and a difficult conversation, exactly what we want these conversations to be. So I would urge the audience members and everyone to please attend again, because in that way we sustain this conversation, even if it sounds like it's a different topic. We are really trying to rethink this concept of Ubuntu, and it's important to involve as many people as possible in this conversation. I quickly want to thank the individuals behind the scenes who made this work. My wonderful colleague, Dr. Geraldine Frieslar, thank you so much for handling the questions. Our ultimate Alvandre Galant, our IT manager and who co-hosted this session. Thank you so much, Alvandre. He has to deal with me the whole day with my anxieties and tension. So thank you, Alvandre. And then our colleagues at Michigan State, who are always ready to lend a hand. Beza Desta, Upenyu, Nicole McKenzie, thank you very much. I'm not going to waste any more of your time. I want to ask you to join us on the 14th September. I've put the details in the chat file. And if you want the contact details for Professor Moyo and Dr. Molefe, I haven't checked with them, but if you write to me, I put my email in the chat file. I will check with them first and then share their contact details with you. And I want to ask the panelists to just stay behind for a few minutes. To all of you who took time to participate in this conversation, greetings from all of us. Stay healthy wherever you are, be kind to one another, and goodbye. Thank you very much.